Okay, I'd like to call to order the joint meeting of the Cranston Redistricting Commission and the Cranston Board of Canvassers. It is Tuesday, March 1st at 6:36 p.m. Would Mr. Lima please take the attendance?
Chairman Jack Froney.
Present.
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 Maranta also constitute the membership of the Redistricting Commission. And for the record, also present are Marie G. Russo, GIS Manager, and Tom Lima, City Council Communications Aide. Also, we have on the Zoom call, David Igliosi, who is the Assistant Solicitor assigned to both the Commission and the Board of Canvassers, as well as members of the public.
Thank you, Mr. Lima. Welcome, members of the public and Mr. Igliosi. Our first item is the approval of the agenda we have in front of us. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
That is a motion from Mr. Vieira, second from Ms. Maranta.
Ms. Maranta,
Yes.
Mr. Vieira,
Yes.
Mr. Jack Froney.
Yes. Great, thank you. We also received in our email the minutes from the October 6th, 2021 Redistricting Commission meeting, and we have that for review. I had a chance to review it. I will make a motion to approve those minutes.
Second.
Any discussion? I just actually will make one point. I noticed when we had some feedback from the public about having a hybrid meeting. So I'm glad that we were able to have this hybrid meeting with the Zoom attendance. So that's good. All right, no other discussions, and please take the vote.
Ms. Maranta,
Yes.
Mr. Vieira,
Yes.
Mr. Jack Froney.
Yes. Okay, our next item is public acknowledgements. Having none, I have no acknowledgements today. Any acknowledgements from the committee? Hearing none, we'll move on to public hearing. So this is the public hearing section for the Redistricting Commission to hear comments from members of the public. We have no members of the public here physically in the council chambers, but if there are any members of the public on the Zoom meeting who are interested in making a comment, please raise your hand and the staff will call on you and we would have an opportunity to hear your comments. And this, of course, we're asking that you have your comments directed specifically to scenario A3, which is the map that the the Redistricting Commission previously worked on. So with that, are there any, Mr. Lima, are there any members of the public that have raised their hand? Because I cannot see where that would be right now from where I'm sitting.
Michael Bourguet.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Hi, this is Michael Beauregard from 136 Bluff Avenue. So I just wanted to, I don't know if I can ask a question for clarification because it was a little unclear looking at the website. It seems as if scenario 3A or A3 is pretty much identical to scenario 1A. And I don't know if that was an error on the GIS website, but when I was looking at a comparison of the numbers and the boundaries of those two maps, they seemed almost identical. And so just to make the question clearer, my question and concern is, does scenario 3A take into account the recent decision by the state of Rhode Island to account for about 1,000 or so inmates at the ACI as residents from where they vote rather than at the ACI where they're short-term residents? Because it seems as if based on the lack of difference between those two scenarios that in scenario A3, those folks have still been counted in Ward 6. So that's my question for the commission.
That is a astute observation, Mr. Beauregard, and a good question. I think I can briefly respond to that, but certainly I'll ask our registrar to respond as well. But We are under obligation as a board. We can't make any decisions. Obviously, those decisions beyond who's included in terms of the ACI and the inmate population is beyond us. So we only take direction. Our primary direction that we took both for A1 and through A3 was really the city charter, which does not asked us not to do that. So but I'll ask Mr. Lima to give some additional commentary because I think that'll help further answer your question.
Sure. Thank you, Chairman. So I can explain it a little bit in depth because it's actually pertinent and relevant for the rest of the meeting as well. So, we have had 3 map scenarios, of course, that have been reviewed by the commission since September. Scenario A1, which was released and reviewed by the commission at first in September, then had a public hearing in October. Scenario A2 was only around for a couple of days. That was when the final map D from the state was sent to the General Assembly. We were able to put that together that reflected the final precinct lines in map D. The precinct lines, however, still worked with the ward boundary lines. So there were no changes between A1 and A2 for the ward lines. And then once in the General Assembly, there was an amendment or sub A, substitute A, which is the General Assembly's terminology for amendment, that happened to the proposal that they had, which basically just cleaned up the census blocks a little bit, involved a couple of blocks that had no population along the Cranston-Warwick boundary, on the Patuxent River. That they're basically in the General Assembly's version, they had the wrong border for the city of Cranston. It might have been off by a few yards. So that was corrected in scenario A3. So basically the workflow from A1 to A2, A3, it's the exact same ward lines throughout the entire process, and also uses the same population numbers and figures. So it does not, to answer your question specifically, it does not incorporate the changed population data that the state use for state representative and state Senate district lines. There's a couple of different reasons for that. The first and primary reason is when the city council debated that very issue last February and March, the council made a policy decision at the time to not direct the Cranston Redistricting Commission to alter the census population numbers. And if memory serves, that decision was made under legal advice at the time from the council solicitor, which, as Chairman Jack Roney, I think, noted, involves the city charter, which has a requirement that the city is to only use census population data in its redrawing of the ward boundaries. So a deviation or an alteration of that data could be construed as a violation of the charter. Now, the charter, of course, is a living document. It's subject to amendment. And I think individual members of the council said that it's possible that it could be amended in the future, or even said that they may consider putting in an amendment in the future. But any amendment to the charter would have to first go to the voters of the city in order to be effective. And that really can't happen until at least the November election, if not a future election, depending on the will of the council to put it on the ballot in the first place. So that's the first part of that answer. The other part is the actual direction from the state itself. So the State Reapportionment Commission was meeting concurrently with us. They started a few months after this commission did in September. Of course, we started back in May, but when the State Reapportionment Commission voted on and decided this issue at one of their, I think it was their second to last meeting, they specifically included in their motion that their decision does not impact or change anything for municipalities, but they did also leave the door open for municipalities, if they chose to, from a policy perspective, to adjust the census block population numbers. And that doesn't just apply to Cranston, it actually applies to all 39 cities and towns, because what the state actually did was reallocate a portion of the population, I believe it was incarcerated persons who were there for less than 2 years at the ACI, to all 39 municipalities for the purposes of the state redistricting data. So that option was left to cities and towns. I don't know which cities and towns are or aren't taking advantage of it. I believe Providence is. I can tell you that we wanted to see what that data would look like at a staff level. So we could perhaps even answer questions about what a changed map would look like. And we requested the data. It was actually stated by their state special commission on reapportionment in one of their meetings that the data would be made available on request. We've actually sent like 3 requests for that data. And as of today, we still haven't received the data that we requested yet. So even if we wanted to, as an exercise, see what that would look like, we actually don't have the ability to do it because we don't have the access to the data that the state used in the process. That said, as the first point is really the controlling point, which is the provisions of the charter. And under the provisions of the charter, Mr. Chairman, this special commission review portion, which gets its direction from the council, and which is already basically discussed and decided the issue, there isn't really any authority from this body to alter or change the process by which apportionment is done in the city. And so basically to take a very long answer and shorten it, the commission has used 2020 census data unaltered in its process to date, including during the scenario A1, A2, and A3 plans.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So just a quick follow-up on that. Thanks for the explanation, Nick. That was really helpful. The only question I have is if Providence is attempting to attribute those inmates to their last known address based on their voter registration, is there the possibility then that folks that we are counting as voters in Ward 6 may also be counted as voters in Providence, for instance, or any other municipality that chooses to use that data?
I can't really speak to that. We do have our assistant solicitor, David Igliozzi, on the call, Chairman. I can just tell you from a practical standpoint that the lines that are drawn in each municipality are drawn in a vacuum in that municipality. So what we do here doesn't really affect another town. That's not the same at the state level. Obviously, when you're drawing a rep and senate district, they do cross boundaries between towns. Any actions we take here in Cranston, though, does not have a corresponding or equal action to other towns. But if Solicitor Igliozzi has anything to add or expand upon that.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
We can.
Good evening, everyone. Again, nice to join you on Zoom. I did listen to the conversation. The state law requires you to only vote in one location, if I understand the gentleman's question. So they could not be counted in two locations. They could only be counted in one location. And I know there's a conflict between the state's approach and the city's approach, but that's going to affect, ultimately, it's going to be a focus of where you're counting them. Ultimately, where somebody is registered to vote will be a function of their legal right to vote. Does that make sense?
That does. I think just to clarify the question, and thank you for that explanation. So if I understand this correctly, under state law, it's a limitation for one person to vote in one location. But for the sake of just, again, this hypothetical, Providence and Cranston could be considering that same person a potential voter in two different locations. Is it because it's municipal record versus a state voter, or the person registers to vote at the state level, but according to Cranston voter rolls and Providence voter rolls, that same person could be attributed to two different locations. Is that correct?
I think that's correct for purposes of establishing the number of voters for the district only. Does that make sense? In other words, if you say the district is supposed to have 15,000 voters plus or minus 500, then those plus or minus X could be counted in multiple districts for establishing the district, but they would not be allowed to vote in both places.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for the explanation. I would just offer as my final comment that given that fact, it would be wonderful for the city to move in the direction of attributing folks who are short-term residents of the ACI towards their last known place and the place to which they're registered to vote, because it still raises the issue of potentially having disproportionate representation for Ward 6 voters, because there are voters who functionally are unlikely to vote at the ACI. So I would just raise that as my final point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beauregard. Appreciate the question and the comments. Are there other members of the public that have questions, Mr. Lima?
See no additional public comment.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Having no other members of the public that wish to make comments, we're going to move on to our sixth item, old business. The commission of the board may hear an update from the staff regarding requests for the commission to the General Assembly to consider an increase in the voter precinct cap, which I think this is a breaking news in action update we have at the moment.
Yes, Chairman. So as we speak, the House Committee on State Government and Elections is hearing legislation that I drafted and that was submitted on behalf of the Cranston Redistricting Commission and Cranston Board of Canvassers to the General Assembly that would alter the voter precinct cap, which is currently set in under state law to be not substantially more than 3,000 voters, which the Board of Elections interprets to be up to 3,500 voters, which is what we functionally use to establish the upper limit for our polling places. We have right now, as of the 2020 election process, several polling places that are over 3,000 voters, but none that are above 3,500 because of that interpretation. The effect of that, as we've discussed in previous meetings of both the board and the commission, is damaging to the elections process because, as you know, and before I even explain it, I'm going to get to this first point. I am signed up to testify at that ongoing hearing right now. And if my phone rings, I do apologize to those watching at home. We're probably going to take a quick recess. I might even just do it live here on the stream and testify to this point, because as I mentioned, it's a bill supported by these bodies and it's relative and pertinent to what we're doing right here and now. It's just a coincidence of scheduling that they decided to put it on this tonight. But like I said, the actual rationale for this is, as we've seen, not just because of the pandemic, but going back to 2018, 2016, and 2014, there is a ever increasing trend in the use of mail ballots, and now an ever increasing trend in the use of what officially is called emergency voting, but we all know is actually, in fact, early voting in the state of Rhode Island. And that trend is national. There are already states outside Rhode Island where more ballots were cast prior to Election Day than on it prior to 2020. In 2020, in Rhode Island became one of those states where more ballots were cast prior to Election Day than on it. Approximately in Cranston, 1/3 of voters voted early at City Hall. 1/3 of voters voted by mail. And this is rough approximations, and 1/3 of voters actually voted at the polling places on Election Day. We still opened up all 30 polling locations in the city. We staffed them as if all the voters that we would normally expect, 60% to 65% turnout in a presidential year, would go up at those polling places. And that was, in a word, overkill. It's an unnecessary use of resources, and because of the amount of logistics and planning that goes into supplying, finding, staffing those locations, hiring poll workers, paying them, training them, making sure that they're there and there's backups ready for them. It's an incredible amount of work. It takes our staff of 3 full-time employees plus myself literal months to put all that together. So the issue for us is, if we have to open up 30 polling locations, or say 25, it doesn't sound like a big difference, reducing by 4 or 5, but it actually is a tremendous difference. But you're talking about the difference between hiring 40 fewer poll workers and having to prepare supplies for 5 fewer locations, and having to make phone calls and coordinate logistics with and deliveries and setup times with 5 fewer locations. That translates to hundreds of hours of work. And the reason we want to consolidate some of those locations isn't because we're lazy, but basically because we know we're spending more time than we ever had before, and we will continue to spend more time than we had before processing that increased volume of mail ballots, processing the increased use of early voting, and managing that entire process for 20 consecutive days prior to the election. Those are monumental challenges. And in the past, we already had our hands full preparing and staffing the polling locations when 95% of voters were using them. Now we're spending that exact same amount of time staffing and preparing those locations when only 30%, 35%, 45%, whatever the number, ends up averaging out to over the course of the next few election cycles, voters are actually using those locations on election day. And we're trying to find more time in the day than we actually have to manage the other two processes. So that's kind of a little preview of my testimony that will be coming up later tonight to the House State Government Elections Commission committee. Because basically what the argument is, at the core of the argument is, as an administrative function of running the elections in the city and for the other 38 boards of canvassers around the state as well, we just don't have the ability or the funding or the staffing or the resources to manage all three processes at 100% capacity as if they're going to all be used that way, because we know not all will be used at 100% capacity. And we know that when there's 3,000 people, voters assigned to a polling place, the actual number of voters that are expected to show up are between 600 and 1,000, because when you got 3,000, the actual turnout could be 50%, say, and that's a high end for a midterm election year. So that's 1,500 voters. Of those 1,500, let's bring the 2020 numbers down a little bit. Let's say it's a third. Let's say 25% vote by mail, 25% vote early. That's 25% and 25% of 1,500. So you're still only talking about 750 voters showing up at a polling place that by law says can handle 3,000. So that number is artificially low. And we've put in legislation sponsored by Rep. Baginski in the House and Senator Lombardi in the Senate, with a number of other co-sponsors for both companion bills that will hopefully increase that. The initial legislation is an increase to 4,000. I've been in communication with John Marion from Common Cause Rhode Island, Steve Brown from the ACLU. Both organizations are supportive conditionally of an increase in the voter precinct cap. They would like to see the number 35 to go to 3,500. And of course, due to the not substantially more than language, that means we could technically go up to 4,000. But for the by and large, most polling places would never even see that much because there aren't that many people in voting to begin with. So to basically summarize, this will need to happen relatively quickly. Not only this commission, but 38 other cities and towns are undergoing re-precincting as we speak. You've got towns small that may have one precinct, but they're right up against that cap, and they may need to draw a second precinct for the first time. And for a town like Little Compton that has one full-time staff member who not only does elections, but also is the town clerk, to double their number of poll workers, doubling their number of locations, that's a big ask. It's doubling their budget too. For us here, it's the difference, as I mentioned, of $5,000 or $6,000 per election, and hiring an extra 35 or 40 poll workers for every election for the next 10 years. That's over $100,000 just for the city of Cranston in overall costs, and statewide it's millions. So it's not a cost issue; it's an elections administration issue. We see where the need is. We need to be able to be a bit more flexible and adapt to that, and put the resources where they're actually being used by voters. That's what this legislation is intended to do. I've informed the sponsors in both chambers that we're supportive of either number, 4,000 or 3,500. But the key is the legislature will have to act in the next couple of weeks in order for this to have an impact on this process. The Board of Canvassers has the legal authority under Rhode Island General Law 1711-1 to precinct or redraw districts at any time. So say the law passes in May, we could technically do it in June. At that point, we're already in the midst of candidate declaration and filing. We want our mailer for redistricting to go out in May. We need to be done with this process at that point. We could maybe consider it for 2024. But if we want a chance to make sure this happens in 2022, now's the time. One final piece on this, Chairman. If you look at the map, we're going to be discussing later, we have one polling place, Glen Hill School, that's at 3,400 and change voters. That's a polling place that in an election year, if the voter rolls expand, we get more registrations in and we do less list maintenance by law. So that's a polling place that could very well be forced under the current law to be split up into two polling locations completely necessarily. Instead of having everyone in that neighborhood just go to Glen Hills and vote, Glen Hills can support it. It's got the parking, it's got the space. We would staff it accordingly. We would have to break off a few hundred of those voters and send them to, say, the central library, which, that's adding more logistics, more time. It's not effective use of our elections administration time. So that's my update. We're again, I've gotten a lot of good feedback and support. I think about 15 or 16 other cities and towns have sent in letters in addition to our office in support. The Board of Elections today sent in a letter of support from their staff. The board itself hasn't heard it yet, but like as I mentioned, even Common Cause and the ACLU are supportive conditionally of the idea because they see the same problems that we do and they want them addressed.
So Mr. Lehman, just a quick question on this. I think all good points about the effect it has on the city and the cost, and that's certainly a real negative effect, I think, on the city. But from a voter perspective, is it fair to say as a practical matter, if we have to break up polling places, there's only so many polling places you can actually put polling places buildings we could actually put them in. So there's a practical effect on the voters, because if we have to break off, say 100 voters and put them in a weird spot, it creates what are called pocket precincts. Is that fair to say? And so it's very inconvenient and not great for the voter on election day.
It's extremely inconvenient for the voter because like I said, when we lose that flexibility, if you got 3,700 voters or 3,600 voters assigned to a place, you wouldn't break off 100, you'd probably break off 800 or 900. It all depends on what the extra polling place that you now have to find can support. But that polling place more than likely is going to be outside of that precinct, out of district, which requires a unanimous vote of the board and approval of the state board of elections to enact. And then that's just the reality. If you look at current precinct 730 Orchard Farm School, which is currently the largest precinct in the state, we've got 3,400 voters there now. If we had to split that, we'd have two options. We either have to use both the cafeteria and the gym in the same building just to comply with the letter of the law, and the voters would have to go in and go left or right depending on what side of a road they live on. We'd have to draw that precinct line. And the actual effect of that would be that people are all still going to the same place, but they just have to go to one room or the other. That doesn't make any sense. I'd rather put the extra couple poll workers in the main room and we can handle that. We do it all the time. Or we'd have to find another location, and there are no other locations in the rural part of Western Cranston that could work with us and meet ADA compliance. So those voters would be going out of precinct. And if you add that up to 3, 4, or 5 precincts around the city, right now we're looking at 25 potential polls for 2022. We could very easily be back at 30 by 2024.
So this item indicates votes may be taken. I don't think we need to take a vote on this particular item, do we?
Well, the commission has already voted to support it, and the commission is comprised of the board, so that's kind of a given. The board supports it. I did put that on in case the board wanted to take any action, but at this time, like I said, I'm actually waiting for a call now to testify on this very issue to the people that have the power to hopefully address it for us.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from the members of the commission?
Question. I'm looking. Pushing it. Is that? Hello. Okay. Can you hear me? The question, I'm looking at the list of precincts and polling locations, and we're talking about the numbers, and I'm looking at Western Hills Middle School and Cranston West. One of them has, Cranston West only has 826, and Western Hills has 1,828. I know on the meeting the other morning when we were talking about having 2 separate greeters and having the 2 precincts in the same building, wouldn't it make more sense to do that all at Western Hills?
Yes, and actually that's a point I'm going to bring up when we get to that point on the agenda.
Okay, thank you. Good question and an astute observation. Great. Any other questions, comments? Okay, great. Hearing none, we'll move on to the new business item. Our first item is the commission will hear an update regarding the state reapportionment process to be enacted, state legislation and congressional district lines. Mr. Lima.
Thank you, Chairman. I already gave you a little bit of an update of the state process. We discussed the ACI prisoner reapportionment, so I won't repeat that process, but elsewhere in the state process, as you know, we paused this commission's meetings back in October while we were waiting for the state to complete its work. In the interim, if we had received any other maps or any other ideas from the public, we probably would have had a couple more meetings to address those, but nothing came in. The state, I attended, I forget how many meetings they had, it was 17 or 19, but I think I attended maybe a dozen or so of their meetings. I testified at a few, mostly to talk about procedure. and what the municipalities needed from the state. And what we really needed more than anything was for them to hurry up. The process was completed, I think, by February 1st in 2012, which allowed the cities and towns about 2 months, 2.5 months to complete their process. This time around, I think it was mid-February by the time the governor actually had the bill on his desk and signed it. So we lost a couple of weeks there, which is why we're having this meeting tonight instead of, I would have preferred to have it maybe 2 weeks ago. But beyond that, the state process went, I think, well for the city of Cranston in terms of the lines that they actually came out. As board member Patron just mentioned, there are a couple pocket precincts that we're going to have to deal with. I think that was kind of inevitable when you have a lot of competing political forces at the state level. You do end up with some pockets. And not all of them are solvable. Some are caused because somebody wants a line somewhere, and some are caused just because that's the nature of the map. They have to, end up drawing lines that don't always work the best for us for elections administration, but at least work for what their purposes are, which is to balance out the rep and senate districts in terms of population. They use the same plus or minus 5% that we do. At the congressional level, they approved congressional map B, which makes no changes to the city of Cranston. Portions of the Cranston boundary are a congressional boundary, just as they are now, although the boundary itself has changed slightly. One thing I did ask the state was to make sure that the voters on Edgewood Boulevard are not in a different congressional district than the voters in Edgewood Boulevard in Cranston. As you know, we have that's a boundary line that goes right through the houses of every person that lives in that street. So you have people that live in that street where one's registered in Providence and one's registered in Cranston, which is an issue for elections administration. Sometimes in the past, we've seen people go to the wrong polling place because of that. We try to do everything we can. And we were trying to ask the state for a way to solve that, but absent a solution, at the very least, the state made sure that the street in itself is in the same district. So that, you don't have people voting in the same house for different Congress people, which might actually be problematic at a federal level. So they respected that testimony. They also respected a lot of the other testimony we provided, including our neighborhood and community map of interest map. If you note on our scenario A3 plan, our ward lines and most of our precinct lines actually match up with the neighborhood lines, which are major roads, natural features, and known natural dividers between the major and minor neighborhoods and subdivisions in the city. There are some exceptions to that, which we'll go over when we get into the actual ward plan. Those are unfortunate, but for the most part, I'd say 90% of what we testified about, 90% of what we submitted in terms of ideas or submissions were used. One of the original plans would have had the district line near where the Ward 1 and 2 boundary is, in a jagged way, running up through neighborhoods, crossing through neighborhoods around the Elmwood Ave area. We pointed that out, and in the later map scenarios, they corrected it and instead used, I believe they used Route 95, which is what our proposed ward line is, as the boundary. And that's an ideal boundary for the wards because it's a neighborhood boundary. It doesn't split up a neighborhood between 2 different representative or senate districts. But there are, like I said, at least 3 pockets and a couple of other areas in the city where they didn't exactly follow our neighborhood lines. There are 2 houses that we're aware of where a rep district line cuts through the house. They're both pretty, I think, easy to figure out if we had to make a judgment call as to which rep district those houses will be assigned to. That's an item we'll discuss on the agenda when we get to the Board of Canvassers action for precincting. But beyond that, as you know, the state process wrapped up just about 2 weeks ago. Once it got to the General Assembly, it was in and out in 2 weeks. They had the hearing, it was on the floor the next week. They passed it, and it was on the governor's desk, who signed it the very next day. So they did help us on the back end in terms of getting it done quickly after their hearing process the last few months. That is now allowing all 39 of us, in terms of cities and towns and boards of canvassers and redistricting groups, to get together and figure out our part of the process here over the next few weeks. Our final deadline, as I mentioned, is April 15th to completely finish this process. That includes the city council element.
Thank you, Mr. Lehman. Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that we are the way ahead of the curve, thanks to your work, thanks to Ms. Giarusso and the work that the staff in the office have done. So, okay, so our next item is item B, which is to review and discuss specific items. Do we have to take a vote, I presume, on each of these individually, these 4 items that are listed here?
I would probably be best, yes, because they're separate items, yeah.
Fair enough. So do you want to offer maybe brief comments at the beginning of each one, just to point you specifically addressing that particular item? Obviously, the biggest one is the talking about the map for number 1 for the ward lines, but if you want to go ahead and give brief comments on each line, and we'll ask our questions and take a vote.
Sure. So on the first item, the recommended ward lines for map scenario A3. These are as I mentioned earlier, the same ward lines as A2 and A1, the same ward lines that were discussed originally by the commission in September, and that were presented to the public in a public hearing in October, at which point the commission adopted it as its working preferred draft map going forward, unless something else has been submitted to compete with it. We've had that open for public comment since that October meeting. We have received a few comments. They're all positive. We haven't received any negative comments. We haven't seen anyone saying, why are you doing this? Or, why is this line drawn here? The comments we have received are more along the lines of, oh, this makes sense, or this does make sense with the charter, or this complies. There haven't been a lot of comments. I can probably count on one hand how many came in via email. We did let the city council know. We had a full update. Chairman Jack Voney and I were at the council in October. We invited the council to come in, take a look at the proposal. We invited the school committee to come in, the mayor's office, the administration, and we invited the general public as well via the notices and information on our website to either come in and take a look at the map, ask questions about it, provide feedback on it, or if they wanted to draw a new map or draw new ideas for a map using the free District R tool that we had linked on the website. And like I said, we didn't really get a lot of feedback. We got none that was negative, and we got some feedback that was positive. But overall, I think the indication was from everyone that we spoke with or that we heard from was that the direction the commission was heading in with that scenario A series map was the right direction, and there wasn't really a reason to waver from it. So that's where we've refined, and that's where we've worked on. And when we knew the state lines, we were able to develop the precinct lines that would go along with this map, which is a function of the Board of Canvassers, which is why tonight is a joint meeting. So that's where we are in this map. It's I've explained it at the previous 2 meetings, but as we all know, it complies with the provisions of the charter, particularly the new provisions passed by the voters in 2020 that we had to respect, natural features like rivers, major roads, highways. That the map is not the product of protecting any incumbents or potential candidates for office. None of that was considered in the drawing of this ward map. Nor was it ever considered about drawing into favor or hurt a particular political party. I'm trying to think of the other charter provisions, but the wards are actually more compact and more contiguous than they previously were. There were some questionable issues of contiguousness in the 2012 map that we've been working under the last 10 years. For example, there were some residents on dead-end streets around Spectacle Pond, west of Twin Oaks. They were basically trapped in an enclave of Ward 2, but then had to drive through Ward 3 to get to the rest of the ward. That was corrected in this map. The 2012 map had a number of neighborhoods that were effectively split up. There was East Stadium and West Stadium. There was Forest Hills had a random kind of line that was drawn through the middle of it. Spectacle Pond area is another example. The neighborhood off of Elmwood Ave, it doesn't have a particular name, but it's basically part of that South Elmwood area, was also split up by the Ward 1 and 2 boundary. Auburn was split up in the 2012 map. All of those neighborhoods and a few others were reunited by this ward map. So in terms of the primary direction of the charter, which is to respect neighborhoods and communities of interest, as you know, the board did work on that process last summer when we defined communities of interest and asked for a public comment on that particular element. We kept we exclusively used neighborhood lines and sub-neighborhood lines in the creation of all boundaries and precincts, which is beyond the requirements of the charter. I don't know much else we could do to comply with the charter beyond that, but we've definitely did our due diligence. And I think the scenario A map and the public comment we've received to date certainly demonstrates that.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to recommend the ward lines to like to make a motion to recommend the ward lines for map scenario A3 to the city council for further action.
That's a motion. I will second that motion to approve the recommended ward lines for map scenario A3. Under discussion, I will just say, I think that again, I just reiterate very quickly, just to say that I think we using those neighborhood lines and natural features, I think is a very reasonable. Any reasonable person can look at the map before and after and see that we certainly did that. And it is about apolitical, I think, this process could be. And second of all, I think it does correct some previously potentially dubious line drawings that happened in the past. So I'm very pleased with that end of the process. Any other comments or questions? All right, hearing none. Would the registrar please take a vote?
Miss Maranta,
Yes.
Mr. Vieira,
Yes.
Mr. Jackoni.
Yes. Very good, thank you. Our next item is the final redistricting report for the city council, which we get a copy both in email and have in front of us. I think it probably covers a lot of the topics we've already previously discussed in here. And thank you to Nick, Mr. Lima and the office for their hard work. And of course, the GIS, Ms. Giarusso for the help that she put into this as well. I know it took a lot of work and it's very much appreciated.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to forward the final redistricting report to the city council.
Motion from Mr. Vieira. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second from Ms. Maranta. Any comments or questions?
Yeah, just for the record, I just want to comment on the thoroughness of the report as I read through it. All of my questions were answered in that report, and I want to thank Mr. Lima, Ms. Giarusso, and anyone else on the staff that worked to prepare this report. I think it was well written and gives a good representation of the activities of this board.
I would agree with that. I would just also comment, I think it's too bad we don't have more members of the public on the meeting. This probably is something that will fly under the radar for the people of the city of Cranston, but we are, thanks to the leadership of Mr. Lima, way ahead of the curve. We're way ahead of any other city or town in the state of Rhode Island, who I know, some of which are rushing and panicking as to what to do now. And it's work that it was done early into last year, even during the pandemic. So the hard work is appreciated.
I'd also like to make a comment in that vein, that on the meeting with the State Board of Elections on Monday, it's really obvious that we are a wonderful example to the rest of the state, primarily because of Mr. Lima and the cooperation on this board. And it's wonderful to be referred to as an example for everyone else. I think we should all be congratulated in a day of gerrymandering.
Mr. Lima, is this report, was this report put on the website for the public access? Will it be?
So Chairman and members of the board, first of all, thank you for your comments. I think something that should also be thanked is the Monster energy drinks, because they kept me up the last few nights as I was trying to get this. As you know, I got this to you over the weekend. I've been basically, since the bill passed, I've been working to compile the information and then actually write it. So the actual narrative of the report is 35 pages, and the remaining addendums take it to about 101, 102 pages. Mr. Russo read the report as well, contributed a lot to it. The final report will be posted on the city website tomorrow morning. That's my plan, with just a couple of quick edits, which I just want to run by the board here before there's an actual vote to approve it. So there's a legal analysis section of the report. I'm not an attorney, I'm obviously familiar with the laws related to redistricting, but just for clarity's sake, we don't want to give a false impression that that's written by an attorney or the law department as an official legal opinion. It's more of a summary of the law. So I'm going to change that to, instead of legal analysis, it'd be review of process. That's essentially what the section is. It's more of a
Do you have a page
narrative.
number on that? Just,
One moment.
I just want to make sure we capture it for the.
So you're right.
amendments we have
If
to
you
make.
look at the section 1.4 legal requirements, I'm just going to change the section header to review of process.
Okay. Review of process, is that what you said?
Correct. 1.4. That way, no one walks away with the impression that was written, by a lawyer who's, citing cases and things like that. The narrative is more meant to just explain, the procedures that we followed. A couple other minor things. I've got, copy editing mistake on page 6. I think I said restricting instead of redistricting. I'm going to correct that. That's in section 1.3, last sentence, second paragraph. On page 7, of the last paragraph of the report, I'm going to add a line there to note that in the 2016 process, the city actually created its own maps as part of that it's actually 2014 Davidson case. Just to basically clarifying the record of what transpired at the time that the city went through an effort to create its own maps and data at that time. Also, I noted that the costs of doing this for the city would be around, I had kind of ballparked to $70,000 had we gone to an outside consultant like Election Data Services or some, a lot of other towns or the state uses, rather than doing it in-house. It's actually really closer to about $85,000, looking at some RFPs and talking with Mr. Giarusso about how much the actual software and also the consultant contract were probably of cost. So we're going to clarify it and edit that to $85,000. On page 33, and this is now jumping much further ahead in the report, in the 4th paragraph, again, I'm going to add another notation that the city did create its own maps and data is required in that in the Davidson case at the time. And also the cover of the report. Again, I want to thank Mr. Russo for this one because I was using I think an outdated version of the city CO. We have a better vector PDF or vector file that has a little more clear and more accurate representation of the CO than this one. I'm going to change that in the front cover.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question that I would like to direct to Mr. Igliozzi. Mr. Igliozzi, what would you recommend in section 1.4 that we do with that section? Do we put some type of disclaimer in that it's not legal advice or written by an attorney? And the second question is procedural. I have a motion that I put on the floor to approve the report, but the report is being amended. How do we handle that?
I'm satisfied. I had a discussion with Mr. Lima today. Excuse me, does the board hear me clearly?
Yes.
Yes.
Again, I didn't want to, we don't need to overthink this. I just didn't want, Mr. Lima did a very nice job of explaining the legal principle on the charter, which is 2.0, I think it's 203. It's not in front of me because I'm looking in the computer right now, but I think he did a good job identifying it. I just didn't want the language and the information to be perceived as written by the law department. So I just wanted it not to say legal analysis, or I just wanted it to be entitled, review a process. So 1, I'm satisfied with the title, and 2, I think your motion is fine, unless you want to reword it. Did that answer your question clearly or not?
Yes, thank you. It answered my first question clearly. But because we're making changes to the document, I would be more comfortable with changing my amendment or updating my amendment to say to approve the report as amended.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's correct. That's correct. As amended. But I think what you have to do is you have to make your first motion has to be a motion to amend the report to reflect the changes represented by Mr. Lima. And then the second motion is to approve the report as amended.
So do I withdraw my original motion?
Please do, please do. I'm sorry. I misunderstood your question. I apologize.
The original motion doesn't need to be withdrawn because it's it's been motion, the original motion is made and seconded, it's on the floor. So all you have to do now is amend the main motion, which is,
Again, Mr. Lima is saying one thing and you're saying another, Mr. Igliozzi. Do I withdraw?
Yeah.
my-
You made a motion to, did you make a motion to approve?
Yes, I did.
Okay, then there needs to be a motion to amend is what I meant. I thought someone needs to make a motion to amend.
Okay, so
A motion to amend to accept Mr. Lima's changes.
I'm amending my original motion.
Well, yes, someone needs to make a motion to amend. You or someone else.
Okay, so I'll make a motion to amend to reflect the changes as discussed by the registrar, Mr. Lima.
And there needs to be a second and a vote taken on that.
I'll second that.
Seconded by Mr. Vieira. Please take the vote.
on the amendment, Ms. Maranta,
Yes.
Mr. Vieira,
Yes.
Mr. Jackvoni,
Yes.
votes of 3 in the affirmative.
All right, and so on the main motion, which is
As
to,
amended.
as amended, to approve as amended.
I'll second that motion.
Ms. Maranta,
Yes.
Mr. Vieira,
Yes.
Mr. Jackvoni.
Yes. Very good, thank you. Thank you, Attorney Igliozzi. for
Yeah,
the-
sorry for any confusion, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. I know the technology is a little quirky.
Very good. So our next item is the redistricting ordinance for the city council, which I believe is in the report we just approved. Are we
Yes.
on this? This is just a matter of approving this or taking a vote to forward this to the city council?
Exactly. It's, we've drafted it at the staff level, presenting it to the commission, so you're aware of what the council will be getting, which the ordinance is the legal reflection of the visual map. It lists a list of census blocks that's compiled by Mr. G. Russo using GIS software. There are two schools of thought when it comes to representing ward boundaries, legal boundaries in text and law. The older way of doing it, prior to dates before GIS, when we had to look at a paper map and figure out where the line was to establish, well, you've got a ward that starts at a point of origin, which could be on the Providence-Cranston boundary line, proceeding southerly along Route 95, and then turning east on Main Street, and then northeasterly for 200 yards along Joe's Fence, and then along a stream that may change course. So it's a less precise way of describing what a boundary is. And it's also open to interpretation. So somebody in California could look at that and not really know where Joe's Fence is or what that stream is called and come up and draw a different line based on the same information. So the Census Bureau, when it conducts census count operations, uses block boundaries. That's what our entire operation is built off of. Those block boundaries are not subject to interpretation. They are universally translatable language. So someone in California or on the other side of the world could take this GIS data, this set of numbers, say this is the 2020 census data, and they could take that, and those numbers all correspond to an exact coordinate, an exact point on the map that would represent that block, and that is not subject to change because the river's changed. The block is still there. Now, I'll ask Mr. Giarusso if I'm explaining that right.
Yes, that's correct. It's not a point, though. It's each block is a specific area.
So the reason I'm explaining this is obviously in the ordinance, you'll see there's a few pages that are just long walls of numbers, and that's what those numbers are. They are the direct reflection of that. Anyone could copy that text, put into a GIS program, and you'd get the exact shapefile or the exact map that would create, as long as you were using the 2020 census data. The ordinance has other savings clause language, most of which is reflective of similar language that's in the state. For example, our current council that was elected by the voters in 2020 for a 2-year term continues in office until their term expires under the terms of the charter in January of 2023, upon the election and qualification of their successors. So the ordinance reflects that by saying, basically confirming the fact that those council members, even though we're changing, not we, but the council will be changing the ward boundary map of the city, it's only actually effective right now for the purposes of elections and voter registration. So when somebody registers to vote, after this is enacted, they'll be registering to vote in the new ward, but the current office holders continue to represent the previous ward boundaries. And that is true for anything else in the city that's not elections related until such time as the new council is sworn in January. And then, at that point, the new boundaries are in effect universally, just about every case. There's some other savings clause language in the text of the ordinance. The ordinance is not, I'd say, in its absolute final form. It could very well be the final form. It is still subject to review by the law department. It's still subject to amendment by the council. The council will be scheduling a special council meeting on March 7th for the purpose of just introducing these materials and referring them to the ordinance committee. There'll be no discussion or debate that night, to my understanding. And then 10 days later, March 17th, the council already has an ordinance committee meeting scheduled. So at that ordinance committee meeting is when the council would then be discussing this ordinance, and Chairman Jack Voney and I will be present at that meeting to answer any questions that the council has and present this final report in its final form, which again will be edited tomorrow morning and posted on the city website for the public to review over the course of the next 3 weeks. The council at that ordinance meeting, if it so chooses, and I would recommend that they do, would be to forward their final plan to the full council for a vote. And again, an additional public comment on March 28th. That's the regular council meeting on the 28th. That would be the final action for the council in this process. Assuming the final map is approved on the 28th, it then goes to the mayor's desk because this is an ordinance, and under the charter, all ordinances go to the mayor for approval or veto. Obviously, if it's vetoed, I doubt it would be, but it's up to the mayor. It requires a 2/3 vote of the council with override. So that's why that March 28th meeting is important, because it still has to get to the mayor's desk then. And then, if it has to go back to the council, there needs to be time there, because as I mentioned earlier, this has to be done by April 15th. So we've got a couple of weeks there after the council finishes its work on the 28th. And that's when Mr. Russo and I will be going through our street ranges and street file, the actual data we're going to send to the Secretary of State on a staff level.
So, Mr. Lima, I have just a clarifying question because I'm unfamiliar with the ordinance process in the city. Are we submitting this ordinance to the city council for consideration, or are we just forwarding the recommended wording for the ordinance?
We are just the latter. I think in this case, we're forwarding the recommended wording for the ordinance. I've talked to the council president, and he's agreed to sponsor whatever comes out of the commission, so that all ordinances under the charter has to have a sponsor, whether it's the mayor or the council member. Under the charter, an ordinance cannot be heard unless it's an emergency ordinance for at least 7 days after it's introduced, which is why the hearing on the 17th is 10 days after it's introduced. And ordinance cannot be finally passed for at least 10 days after it's introduced, of course, to March 28th as well after March 7th. Under the charter as well, all ordinances have to be advertised in a newspaper local circulation. And I believe the city clerk's office already has draft language that's going to be prepared to run in, I think, next week's Cranston Herald. That would advertise the ordinance. So that way, all the boxes of the charter are checked there. It's tight. There's only a couple of days of room to work with on a lot of those things. So there's really no margin for error, but that's why the process is accelerated as it is at this point.
Okay, so just to confirm that this commission does not have the authority to recommend an ordinance to the committee. They're just recommending that, we're forwarding recommended wording for their consideration to create an ordinance.
I'd ask the solicitor Igliozzi to clarify that.
Mr. Chairman, if you can hear me, that's correct. Only a council person can sponsor an ordinance, or the mayor. But this redistricting committee has very specific responsibilities to provide the proposed lines under the charter. So it's obviously being provided for that purpose, and I believe the council is going to accept it as presented.
Okay, with that being said, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to forward the recommended wording for an ordinance for the city council's approval.
Consideration.
Consideration is the word.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. I will second that motion. Any further questions or discussion on this item? Hearing none, would the registrar please take the vote?
Ms. Maranta,
Yes.
Mr. Viera,
Yes,
Mr. Jack Boney.
Yes.
The votes are 3 in the affirmative.
So our next item is very similar, which is to forward suggested language for a resolution memorializing the language to the city council for a suggested resolution memorializing the General Assembly to enact Cranston's redistricting plan into law. And this is to forward to the Cranston City Council. I will make that in the form of a motion.
I'll second that.
Any questions or discussion on this? Is very similar, I think, to the last one, just basically saying, City Council, please pass a resolution asking the General Assembly to approve.
Yeah, that's right. And all, both in the redistricting report, there's a draft of this resolution as well as a draft of the legislation that will be forwarding to the General Assembly as soon as this is in city law, as soon as the mayor's signature is on it. That day or the day after, I'll be sending an email to all the reps and senators in the city saying, could you please co-sponsor this local act for consideration in the General Assembly? And that way we can get this process wrapped up.
Very good. Any other questions, comments? Hearing none, please take the vote.
Mr. Maranta,
Yes.
Mr. Viera,
Yes,
Mr. Jack Boney.
Yes,
Votes are 3 in the affirmative.
thank you. And our final item here is item C. The board may review, discuss, amend, and or conditionally approve the polling location.
Sorry, I
Go ahead, Mr.
just
Lima.
one thing.
So just we may conditionally approve the polling location and precinct lines subject to the approval, the ward map by the Cranston City Council, and then subsequently subject to the approval of polling locations and precincts by the Board of Elections. And I believe we have the spreadsheet in front of us that includes all of the suggested 2022 to 2030 Cranston perspective permanent polling locations. These are informed obviously by the map that we just approved. And this includes the details of the precinct, the congressional rep district, the Rhode Island Senate local ward, and the ward district, including polling place name and address and the number of voters.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to conditionally approve the Cranston polling locations and precinct lines, subject to approval of the ward map by the Cranston City Council, and subject to approval of polling locations and precinct by the Board of Elections.
May I ask a couple of quick questions first?
I just would need a second. Do we have a second on that?
Second.
Okay, we're having a motion and a second on that, and I believe Ms. Patron has a question or a comment.
But Chairman, I could actually, I might actually, I just have explanation for this one before we.
Oh, that's right. This is also the Western Hills, Cranston West. So Mr. Lima?
Oh, yeah, if you want to go first.
Well,
So yes, so that's our smallest pocket precinct in the state. So on the map, that's 5-4. But I'll take a quick step back on that first. So the way that the state has asked us to do precincts as a formula for how precincts are assigned. As you know, we're alphabetically, we're the 7th town in the state. So 07 is how all of our precinct numbers start. And then 00 is our emergency voting location. And then from 01 on, that's our polling places. Right now, we have 31 precincts in the city. This map has us at 26. One of those 31 right now is a paper precinct. It's only commercial property there. There are no registered voters. There are not likely to be. So it's still assigned as a precinct because it's geographic territory with a different ballot style, but it's not actually used as a polling place. Same thing in this map scenario. The precinct, that is the last precinct on the list. So all the other precincts, 0701 to 0725, are labeled by a numbering scheme that's directed by the Board of Elections. Then we also have our wards and our ward districts. So Mr. Russo and I came up with a way to basically number the districts, basically kind of in a clockwise kind of way, starting at 12 o'clock and going around. So if you look at Ward 1, for example, there are 3 precincts there and goes 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3. So I got that kind of out of the way. So 5-4, which is southern Mashantucket, essentially, because there's a precinct line drawn by the state that runs along, I believe, the bike path, north to south, and then juts a little bit west, and then runs again northwest. That precinct line is a different representative district than the rest of Mashantucket, so it creates a pocket of 800 voters in 5-4, which under the polling place plan here on that, I'm actually going to ask the board to amend. And it could be, I don't think we need a formal motion, it can just be a friendly amendment to the plan. What's proposed would be to use Western Hills Middle School. No, I'd rather to use Cranston West, but I think it may actually make more sense to use Western Hills Middle School. And the reason there is, generally speaking, we try to avoid putting 2 different polling locations in the same place because it can create confusion for voters. But Western Hills Middle School gym, which is of course on the same property, is next door. And it's a large gym. There's plenty of space there to set up 2 separate polling operations. As the board members all know, you've seen how polling places have operated on election day. Mr. Ronta has been a poll worker. It can be confusing because I remember back in 2012 or 2010 when I voted at Arlington School. There used to be Arlington School left, Arlington School right, and you know that can be confusing for the voter because you don't know which way to go. And that's why you have a greeter, you have poll workers to direct the voter. In this case, we're talking about a pocket precinct that has 800 voters, of which maybe 400 will vote in the midterm, of which maybe 150 to 200 would actually use the polling place on election day. Those people can be directed by a greeter, I think, successfully to the right poll. And the moderators of the polling location will likely be told, instructed, that informed that there are 2 separate precincts with different machines, different ballots operating there, and make sure they don't obviously mix them up, which is always a concern.
One other one, it looks like here, 3-3, 827 voters, Stadium Elementary.
Right, that's a Rep District 14, and that's a pocket that may be more created by geography than anything else. Without giving any commentary on the Mashantucket one, the pocket there is created in part by the Providence-Cranston boundary. And basically when you start, for example, in the middle and you start working your way out, you eventually run out of space to create new precincts and you end up with a pocket or 2. And that's, I think, what happened there. The line to its north that runs along the bike path and then hooks a right onto Cranston Street before hitting the Providence boundary, that's the Senate district line for I think Senate 27 and 28. The line to the south that runs kind of between Spectacle Pond, Twin Oaks area in the stadium neighborhood is the Rep District 14 line. So if you look at that pocket area, currently the voters on most of that area are voting at through Temple School. This actually makes it much more convenient for them because they can now go vote at Stadium, which is technically out of precinct, which requires approval. But it's out of precinct by an inch because it's across the street from the precinct line. So yeah, that's kind of the background on that. So it would be 4 because both West and Western Hills are out of precinct for that southern Mechanicat area because the way that the General Assembly decided to draw that precinct, there are literally no commercial or city-owned properties inside of that precinct that could actually be a polling place. It's all residential houses. So that one, obviously, we have no choice. And the other 3 are the stadium being one, it's across the street. Woodridge Elementary School, which is technically in Ward 6, but again, it's on the boundary of the Woodridge neighborhood. It's literally across an imaginary line. And the 4th one being the Portuguese Club, which I'll explain in a minute when I go through the whole list. Yeah, at this time, that's the leading candidate. We're probably gonna have a full board of canvassers meeting as soon as this redistricting process is concluded, maybe in early April, to discuss that in depth. But long story short, City Hall, we made it work in 2020, but as you all know, it's not really equipped to hold 1,000 people a day, especially at the time school was virtual. With school in session, this parking lot is full. You can't fit 800 voter cars over the course of an 8-hour day, plus 12 poll worker cars out there. So that's a major focus of our office here for the next few weeks in the board to assign that what will be the new, likely permanent early voting location for the city. The Pastori Youth Center foyer and gym, we would use for different purposes, is the leading candidate amongst every other candidate we've looked at the last few weeks. The senior center being the second candidate, but it'd be very disruptive there to normal programming. It just, for one, the parking isn't as good there, but also we'd have to take up space in the main room that's used during the day. Whereas at the, go ahead. So at Pastori Youth Center, there's both the YMCA lot and the Pastori Youth Center lot, and the staff there will be instructed to park their cars as well as the poll workers in the YMCA lot. There's a little bit of an issue around school dismissal time next door at Bain, but that's not really a huge problem. Mostly because the Pastori Youth Center does a good job of informing the parents not to park in that lot generally. So it's not like the parents sit in that lot and wait. It's mostly concentrated around Bain itself. The other amenities of the facility, though, and we'll get to more detail on that in a few weeks, is it's fully ADA compliant. It's got plenty of space. It's a city-owned building. It can be securable. It's got storage areas where we can lock up equipment at night, whereas other places just don't have that flexibility and don't have 20 days consecutively that they can use it. So I'll very quickly run down this list because I think the board members, especially after 2020, are very familiar with most of these locations. We've got
Mr.
20.
Lima, before you start, I just have a follow-up question to Ms. Patron's question on the early voting site. Do you see any logistical issues by having that site away from the canvassing office? I know there are space issues there, but having that polling place right there, it appeared, at least when I was there, that the staff at the canvassing office was able to address issues and probably make it easier for some people to vote than if it would be off-site and now that person would have to come to the canvassing office, address the issue and go back.
There are, yes, that's a very good point. There are significant logistical issues, and it's really a trade-off at that point. Is it we can make it work better here, but we don't have the interior space downstairs and we don't have the parking. Whereas there, we can make it, we have the space and we have the parking, but we don't have the direct access to our office. There's different ways we're discussing of how to mitigate that. We're actually planning a meeting with the board of elections, a site visit to walk through Pastori, the area we're going to be using to figure out some other logistical concerns. The biggest one though is, yeah, like you said, if a voter goes to Pastoria to vote early, the poll workers aren't trained or equipped to give that voter the information that they may need. What we could end up doing, there's a front desk at Pastoria that has a city computer, a city phone line, 4-digit extension. We could station a poll worker at that location that basically is a direct line to our office. And if it's busy enough or justified, we could actually end up taking one of our 4 staff members, probably on a rotating basis. And during the early voting period, assign a staff member to be at that location. I plan to be there much of the day myself anyway, especially during setup and breakdown. But it may very well turn out. And I think the key is we're going to do this for both the primary and the general. We're asking for about a $50,000 increase in the budget to do that. And the primary is going to be relatively low turnout in terms of early voting. It's going to allow us to basically test this out and make sure it works. And then apply any lessons learned to the general election.
Yeah, my only concern here is that I don't want to put us in a position where we're disenfranchising any voter.
We did nearly 1,000 people here in City Hall. It was crazy. It was really crazy. There wasn't a lot of room. It was very, very cold in November. People were trying to push their way in to come into the building. They're down. A suggestion maybe. Is there any other large space? Could we utilize this because we have an elevator?
So the ADA, there's ADA issues with using this room as a voting location. None of this is ADA compliant, at least as much as it should be for a polling place. This space itself, I mean, they would have to take out the middle divider and actually take out these benches, which are bolted to the ground, in order to use the full room. That's what they did in Warwick. But in Warwick, things weren't bolted down. They were able to clear the room out and use it, their council room, as the early voting site. And then that was on an upper floor. But the building they're using is, I think, more compliant than our building, which is a WPA 1930s era building. Right. Yeah. So this, I mean, if we had the ability to clear out this room, I think it would be big enough. But that's if we had the whole room. Even just half the room, it's not big enough for this would actually be smaller than probably one of our smallest locations. That is not the call I was expecting.
So is the issue space inside the building to house the polling place, or is it outdoor parking with the high school, or is it both?
The main issue is parking with the high school, I'd say. But the other main issue is the space, because if you look at the welcome desk down there, and also, I mean, in 2020, we were very limited on what we could set up. For the volume of voters we were handling, which is up to 1,000 in an 8-hour day, that's like a polling place getting almost 1,800 or 2,000 people in a 13-hour day. So if you look at that same kind of format, what you really should have is about 3 DS200 machines, which there is not space for in the hallway. 3 or maybe even 4 voter check-in stations, which we only had space for 2, and even that was tight. A line queuing space, and as many as 20 to 25 voter privacy booths. And I think we had room for 12. And that was breaking social distancing rules. I think they were 3 feet apart instead of 6. So Providence City Hall had to do the same thing, on their first floor in 2020. That law passed in late July 2020. We had to scramble. We didn't have policies and procedures. We still don't have state policies that govern early voting in places. The Let RI Vote Act, which is running right now, which will codify some of the things. But for the most part, we really had to wing it in 20 and adjust as we went. And I think in applying those lessons learned, if we were ever to get the same volume or even half the volume that we saw in 2020, City Hall is not equipped space-wise to handle it without significantly more room.
Yeah, I'll defer to your recommendation. I just wanted to register my concern about making it harder for people.
And I can tell you that the staff, Ms. Pucci, Ms. Banana, Mr. Brito and I, we've discussed it the last week or so, and they were of the same opinion. We're not unanimous down there on this idea, but I look at it from a logistical standpoint of what we can pull off and what the worst case scenario would be. And my biggest fear would be, like we had the day before the election in 2020, a line from Cranston East to the fire station, and us being unable to process voters fast enough because we just don't have the space to work with. And I'd rather have to troubleshoot and problem solve some logistical hurdles than be in a situation where we could potentially fail because of an overwhelming number of people that we don't have the space to handle.
Like, I understand Mr. Vieira's concern, but as a polling worker previously, and I so many years, I believe the polling workers are very well informed to refer citizens who have questioned, or if they're not found on the polling places, on how to go and get connected to the city hall. So we did it before and it worked perfectly. Like, if somebody went to vote and for some reason they didn't appear on our side, we have somebody that, like, the moderator will call somebody at the city hall and provide this person with information needed, and they actually get to vote either in the right voting poll, or any information that or question they have, it was answered appropriately.
Yeah, I agree with you. We have a lot of poll workers who are very informed and they have a lot of experience. But I also have been to polling places where we've had issues. So I guess we would have to be very careful about who we put in that particular polling place, and that they are experienced people like yourself and others.
Yeah, like maybe better training and put a specific polling workers on those specific places to better help the community.
I think there's something else to point out, is that the folks that are staffing the early voting, they are more experienced, even just by virtue, even if they're new on the first day, by a few days in, they're more, because my experience when we did this last year was that you see the same folks kind of working the polls. So I think just from a space perspective, just to make a better experience with the voters, I mean, what's the percentage of, if I think about the percentage of the voters who might actually have an issue, it's probably a small percentage. So I'd rather service the larger percentage and give them a better experience over the course of that. So that being said, Mr. Lima had to step out, or at least away from the microphone, to potentially testify for the bill that we discussed before. Are there any other questions or comments on the,
I just want to say that I agree with Ms. Maranta. I do believe that we had, especially on emergency voting here in City Hall, we had people who did an amazing job for the amount of voters who came through. It was a stressful situation and they handled it well.
so looking through the list here, I think these are all polling places we're all familiar with. One thing I will note is Ward District 4-2 says Hope Church. That's just a change, the same polling place, different name. That's the Cranston Christian Fellowship formerly, and now I believe it's named the Hope Church. So that is a location we have used in the past. So nothing has really changed from the list I see here. So Mr. Lima mentioned that we could just consider it a minor change to absorb 5-4 into 5-3 to have them both at Western Hills. We do have a motion on the table for that. But
Before we vote on that motion, did Mr. Lima agree with combining those two polling places under Western Hills? Because he did seem to harbor some concern about confusion for the voters.
well, his comment, I heard his final comment was that he felt that the greeter there could accurately direct the voters. So I think he was in
All right,
support of it.
then I'm good with that change.
Okay, that being said, he's not here to actually take the vote. So let's take a very brief recess, because I think his comments to the state will be only 2 or 3 minutes. He doesn't have a lot of time. So we'll take unless there's any objections, take a 5-minute recess.
Okay.
All right, we're going to come back from recess. Mr. Lima is still testifying to the General Assembly. So Attorney Igliozzi, we're just wondering if you can help us here. If we take a vote, do we need him here, or is the record of it on the recording enough for the purposes of what we're achieving tonight?
Mr. Chairman, I think you can take a vote. I think anyone can make a vote and the record will be sufficient. And Mr. Lima can review the record and finish up the minutes.
Very good. That's good enough for me. Thank you for that. So we have a motion, if you recall, on the table, just to refresh our memory, to approve this list of the 2022-2030 Cranston prospective permanent polling locations, with the one adjustment to have Ward District 5-4, which is currently listed as Cranston High School West, but because of the small number of voters there, to move that and include that at Western Hills Middle School.
So, Mr. Chairman, I believe I need to make another motion to approve the polling location list as amended.
I believe that's true, as we did in the last motion. So if you want to make that motion, I'll second that. So we'll go ahead and take the vote. Ms. Maranta,
Yes.
Mr. Vieira,
Yes.
and Mr. Jackvoni, that's me. I will vote yes. So that the vote of 3-0 to approve that. And our final item actually is adjournment. And I'm going to say it probably incorrectly because I didn't take Latin, sin die or sin die, which would just basically what that does just for this is the only, just for the committees. When we make this motion, this is the only adjournment motion that we can have discussion on as a result of the fact that this will actually effectively dissolve the Cranston Redistricting Commission.
Mr. Chairman, before we do that, I'd just like to publicly thank, Mr. Lima's not here, but Mr. Lima, Ms. Giarusso, for all of their help in going through the process and preparing the redistricting report and making the process extremely seamless. And we appreciate your support and your knowledge and expertise there. I also want to thank Mr. Igliozzi for his legal advice and counsel throughout this process. And I also want to thank publicly John Marion, who's the Executive Director of Common Cause Rhode Island. We had a conversation with Mr. Lima at the beginning of the process and recommended a number of best practices that I think greatly improved public access and participation in the process as well, and also increased participation by the public as well. So just want to thank everyone publicly for the
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Before you do that, I think we, just out of an abundance of caution, again, this is just an off-the-cuff comment. Perhaps the committee would consider just making a motion, and I know to authorize Mr. Lima to take any additional editorial or technical changes that are required to meet with the board's intent here tonight in the event that there's some minor discrepancy that needs to be corrected, obviously, because the board cannot meet again. Something about, I would suggest that a motion to authorize Mr. Lima to ratify any and all actions necessary and to authorize Mr. Lima to take any technical or editorial action necessary to with regard to the final approval of the board, to encompass the intent of the final approval of the board. And I know that's kind of an awkward thing, but I'm just concerned because you are adjourning and you can't meet again.
And there's making that type of motion, Mr. Igliozzi, based on the fact that it's not on the agenda. Is that correct?
Right. It's just you're adjourning and you're not again, you're not meeting again. So you're going to move to adjourn, right? But I would ask you to make a motion to just to authorize and ratify any technical or editorial changes necessary to meet. Even though it's not technically on the agenda, I think it's it meets in conjunction with your motion to adjourn.
So is that, just to be clear, is that two motions and two?
No,
votes?
one motion. I would say we move to authorize Mr. Lima, move to adjourn and authorize Mr. Lima to make any technical or editorial comments necessary to meet with the intent of the board, the commission, I'm sorry. And again, this is off the cuff. I wasn't prepared to make this recommendation, but when you just mentioned to me about your adjourning permanently, I just want to make sure that there's no technical issues that pop up later.
Okay, well, I'll make a motion per that suggestion to adjourn and also to authorize Mr. Lima to make any technical or editorial changes needed that will be in the spirit and encompass the intent of the board per our discussion and votes today. I'll make that in a form of a motion. I have a second.
Second.
Any discussion? Hearing none. Would you please take the vote, Mr. Lima, who has now returned from his testimony?
Ms. Baranta,
Yes.
Mr. Viera,
Yes.
Mr. Jackvoni.
Yes. With that, we conclude the meeting. So the joint meeting of the Cranston Redistricting Commission and Cranston Board of Canvassers has adjourned at 8:14 p.m. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to the members